The pilot vanished over open water, so why was his oxygen mask buried beneath an abandoned lighthouse? The question struck Officer Alastair Vautrin only after K-9 Orizin's claws uncovered the first curve of glass beneath the rain-darkened soil. Until then, there had been nothing but wind, fog, and the stubborn pull of a German shepherd who refused to leave. The abandoned lighthouse rose above them on the Nova Scotia headland, its white paint peeled gray by decades of salt. Rain swept across the grass in cold sheets, bending the weeds and rattling the rusted railing around the tower. Beyond the cliff, the Atlantic was invisible, hidden behind a wall of fog, but Alastair could hear it striking the rocks nearly 30 meters below. Somewhere beyond the eastern ridge, a low engine note faded into the weather, too distant to identify and gone before he could turn toward it. Orizin, stop! The dog did not stop. His sable coat was soaked flat against his body, black along the spine and bronze at the shoulders. Mud clung to his legs. He drove his paws deeper into the earth, breathing hard, his amber eyes fixed on the hollow he had opened beside the lighthouse foundation. Alastair tightened the lead. Orizin resisted, not with anger, but with certainty. Then he lowered his muzzle and released a sound so quiet it was almost lost beneath the rain. Not a bark, not a growl. A warning meant for whatever waited underground. Alastair knelt beside him. Easy, boy. The soil smelled of wet stone, iron, and something faintly chemical. Aviation fluid. He knew that scent from years of coastal search operations, from hangars before dawn and wreckage brought ashore in silence. He brushed the mud aside with one gloved hand. A cracked oxygen mask emerged, its clear surface scratched but strangely clean beneath the dirt. It had not washed in with the tide. It had been placed there, buried by someone who had stood on this ground. Alastair's breath tightened. Captain Emmer Calder had disappeared 4 days earlier while flying medical supplies toward an isolated community on Cape Breton Island. Radar showed his aircraft turning east into heavy weather before vanishing over the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Search crews had covered hundreds of square kilometers. They had found one damaged wing panel floating offshore, but no cockpit, no emergency beacon, and no pilot. Yet Calder's equipment was here, more than 40 kilometers from his last confirmed radar position. Orizin pawed once beside the mask, then looked directly at Alastair. There was a thin mark on one claw where stone had split the nail, but the dog seemed unaware of it. Alastair reached to pull him back. That was when he saw the writing. On the inside of the mask, beneath a layer of condensation and dry brown dust, 2 words had been traced by a trembling finger. Not the sea. The wind dropped. For one strange second, even the lighthouse seemed to hold its breath. Alastair stared at the message while rain tapped softly against the glass. Then something sounded beneath them. 3 slow knocks, metal against stone. Orizin froze, ears rising toward the lighthouse floor. The knocks came again. 3 measured strikes from somewhere under the earth. Alastair released the lead. Orizin turned toward the tower and ran. Orizin reached the lighthouse door before Alastair, his paws striking the wet concrete with sharp, urgent rhythm. The old entrance leaned inward on rusted hinges, held shut by a chain that had long ago lost its lock. Alastair pulled it free and pushed the door open. Cold air rolled out from the tower, carrying the smell of damp timber, salt, and machine oil. Orizin stepped inside, then stopped. The circular room was dim, lit only by gray daylight filtering through narrow windows clouded with grime. A spiral staircase climbed into darkness above them. Beneath it, broken tools, coils of wire, and pieces of an abandoned generator lay scattered across the floor. Nothing moved, yet the 3 knocks had been real. Alastair felt them again in his memory, steady and deliberate, not the random settling of old stone. He reached for his radio. Static answered. Search command, this is Officer Vautrin at Vesper Lighthouse. I have recovered possible equipment belonging to Captain Calder. Request immediate support. The speaker hissed, then fell silent. Orizin moved toward the eastern wall. Nose low. He ignored the stairs, ignored the doorway, ignored the mask still hanging from Alistair's hand. Instead, he followed a thin trail of scent across the floor. Alistair saw what the dog had found. A narrow smear of dark oil crossed the concrete and vanished beneath a stack of warped floorboards. He crouched beside it. The oil was fresh enough to shine. Someone had been here recently. Outside, the wind returned, pressing rain against the windows. Hours earlier, before the mask and the knocking, the search vessel had carried them across rough water from the mainland. Captain Calder had been missing for 96 hours. Every official map placed his final position far from this island. Search aircraft had flown wide grids over hundreds of square kilometers. Boats had checked the coves and channels. The cold water offered little mercy, and each passing hour had made the reports more careful, then quieter. By sunrise, the operation commander had spoken of recovery instead of rescue. Alistair had heard that change before. It was the language people used when hope had grown too fragile to speak aloud. Orzen had not accepted it. During the crossing, the German shepherd had stood at the bow, facing away from the open sea. His attention remained fixed on the faint shape of the lighthouse through the fog. Twice Alistair had redirected him. Twice Orzen returned to the same position. At the time, Alistair blamed the wind. He also remembered the low engine note disappearing beyond the eastern ridge, a sound too brief to place and absent from the official search chart. Now, kneeling inside the tower, he understood the dog had been tracking something the entire way. Orzen pressed one paw against the loose boards. A low vibration passed through the floor. Then came another sound. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 knocks. Another pause. 3 more. Alistair held his breath. It was a pattern. Not random. Not the tower. He removed the first board, then the second. Beneath them lay an iron plate fitted with a recessed handle. Rust covered the edges, but the center bore fresh scratches. Someone had opened it recently, then tried to hide it. Orzen looked at Alistair, rainwater, dripping from his muzzle. His expression was calm now. Waiting. Trusting. 8 years earlier, Alistair had ignored a dog that behaved this way during an avalanche search in northern Alberta. He had followed the instruments instead. The instruments had been wrong. A fellow officer had been found too late. That memory had lived inside him ever since, quiet as snow over a grave. He wrapped both hands around the iron handle. Not this time, he whispered. The plate lifted with a groan, revealing a stone stairway descending into blackness. Cold air rose from below. So did the faint smell of fuel, seawater, and human breath. Alistair activated a compact emergency beacon and placed it beside the opening, but the thick stone swallowed the signal almost at once, leaving only a weak, intermittent pulse. Orzen stepped forward, but Alistair held him back for 1 second. From somewhere beneath the lighthouse, the knocking stopped. Then a weak voice traveled up through the dark. "Please." The word rose from below, so faintly that Alistair almost mistook it for air moving through the stone. Orzen did not. His ears sharpened, and his entire body leaned toward the darkness beneath the iron plate. "Captain Calder?" Alistair called. No answer came. Only water dripping somewhere far below, slow and hollow. He switched on his torch and directed the beam down the narrow stairway. The steps curved beneath the lighthouse foundation, wet with condensation and green with age. They descended nearly 6 meters before vanishing around a bend. Alistair tested his radio again. Static filled the tower. The emergency beacon beside the opening continued to pulse weakly, its signal smothered by thick stone. If they went deeper, rescue crews might never receive it. "Close," he told the dog. Orzen moved beside his left leg as they descended. The air grew colder with every step. Salt gathered on the walls like pale frost, and an old electrical cable ran along the ceiling, disappearing into the dark. At the bottom, the stairway opened into a narrow passage lined with rough stone. Water covered the floor to Alistair's ankles. It was not still. A weak current moved inland from a crack in the outer wall, carrying strands of seaweed and flakes of rust. Orzen lowered his nose, tested the air, then turned away from the sound of the ocean. He faced deeper into the passage. Alastair remembered the voyage that morning. Everyone aboard had watched the water, searching for debris, fuel, or color against the gray waves. Orson alone had kept his back to the sea. Now the reason seemed painfully clear. The trail was never leading outward. It was leading in. They advanced 20 meters before Orson stopped beside a strip of blue fabric caught on a bolt. Alastair lifted it carefully. The material matched the flight suit worn by Captain Calder in the photograph distributed to search crews. Farther ahead, a small amber stain marked the stone. Hydraulic fluid. Another 3 meters brought them to a torn piece of medical tape pressed into the mud. It carried salt, but no sand, which meant it had not washed ashore. Someone had walked through this tunnel after leaving the aircraft. Someone injured, exhausted, but alive. Good boy, Alastair whispered. Orson glanced back once, then continued. The passage divided ahead. The left branch sloped toward the sound of waves. The right narrowed beneath the lighthouse and disappeared behind collapsed timber. Alastair studied both routes. The left side held footprints in the mud, clear enough to follow. Orson ignored them. He moved right. Alastair tightened his grip on the torch. The footprints looked convincing, almost too convincing. Each one was deep, evenly spaced, and pointed toward the sea entrance. A frightened survivor would not walk with such perfect rhythm. Orson sniffed the nearest print, sneezed once, and turned away. Whatever human scent had once been there was buried beneath machine oil. Someone had pressed a boot into the mud by hand. A false trail. The German shepherd approached the fallen timber and pushed his muzzle toward a gap no wider than 10 centimeters. A breath of warmer air passed through it. Then came 3 soft knocks from the other side. Orson answered with one low bark. Silence followed. Alastair knelt and aimed his light through the opening. Beyond the beams, something reflected briefly. Not eyes. Metal. A silver emergency bracelet lay on the floor, engraved with the name Emmerich Calder. Beside it, partly hidden in shadow, ran a thin wire stretched across the passage. Alastair froze. The wire led upward toward a small fuel container fixed between the stones and connected to a compact ignition unit. It was not part of the lighthouse. It had been placed there recently. Someone had not merely hidden the pilot. Someone had prepared the tunnel so that rescue itself would become a warning. Alastair lowered his torch until the beam rested on the thin wire. It was almost invisible against the wet stone, tied to a small trigger beneath the fuel container and connected to the compact ignition unit above it. One careless step could have started a fire and filled the narrow passage with smoke. He signaled Orson back with 2 fingers. The German shepherd obeyed at once, retreating half a meter without taking his eyes from the gap in the timber. Stay. Alastair knelt in the cold water and studied the arrangement. It was crude, but deliberate, not designed to bring down the lighthouse, only to make the tunnel impossible to enter. That knowledge brought no comfort. It meant whoever had placed it understood how little air moved beneath the stone. Alastair removed a compact multi-tool from his belt. His hand stayed steady, though an old memory pressed at the edge of his mind. Snow. A buried radio. A dog pulling toward the wrong side of a ridge while instruments pointed elsewhere. He had trusted the screen. The screen had lied. He would not make that mistake again. Orson gave a low breath behind him. I know, Alastair whispered. You found him. Let me get us through. He steadied the fuel container with one hand, disconnected the trigger wire, and separated the ignition unit from its power lead. Nothing moved. No spark. No sudden sound. Only the soft rush of water around his boots. He waited 3 seconds, then 5. The passage remained still. Alastair eased the container away from the stones and set it upright beside the wall. Orson stepped forward only when called. Together, they examined the fallen beams. The timbers looked as though they had collapsed, naturally, but several ends were cleanly sawn. Someone had arranged them to resemble storm damage. Alastair pushed against the first beam. It shifted less than a centimeter. The second was wedged beneath a section of old iron railing. Moving it alone would take time they might not have. The tide chart in his pocket placed high water less than 50 minutes away. Already the current around his ankles felt stronger. Orizon moved to the right side of the blockage and began pawing at loose stones near the floor. "Easy," Alistair said. The dog ignored the larger gap and focused on a narrow seam where warm air escaped. Alistair crouched beside him and cleared away 2 rocks. Behind them lay a hollow channel, perhaps part of an old ventilation system. From within came the faintest human sound. A cough, then a voice, weaker than before. "Do not move the center beam." Alistair leaned close. "Captain Calder, this is Officer Alistair Vautrin. I am with Coastal Search and Rescue. Are you injured?" A pause followed, filled by the slow creak of timber. "Left shoulder, ribs. I can breathe." The answer was strained but clear. "Alive. After 4 days, alive." Alistair closed his eyes for one brief second. Orizon pressed his nose into the opening and whined softly. From the other side came a broken laugh. "That a shepherd? K9 Orizon. Then tell him he has better instincts than your aircraft." Alistair almost smiled. He already knows. He shifted the torch through the opening. The beam revealed a chamber beyond, no more than 4 meters wide. Captain Calder sat against a stone wall, wrapped in part of a silver emergency blanket. His face was pale, and one sleeve of his flight suit was torn, but his eyes were open. Beside him stood 2 sealed medical cases marked for Northern emergency delivery. The medicine had survived. Calder had stayed with it. "Can you reach the right side of the door?" Alistair asked. Calder shook his head. Steel brace came down. "There's another problem." He pointed weakly toward the ceiling. A red indicator light blinked beside a black device fixed to an old support pipe. It was connected by a separate cable that disappeared into the wall. Not lighthouse equipment. Not rescue equipment. A remote signal receiver. Alistair's radio crackled for the first time since entering the tower. A man's voice broke through the static. "Calm. Familia. Officer Vautrin, leave the tunnel immediately." "That is a direct order." Calder's expression changed. Fear entered his eyes before he spoke. "That is him." Alistair kept his eyes on the remote signal receiver while the radio hissed in his hand. The familiar voice came again, sharper now. "Officer Vautrin, acknowledge the order." Orizon stood rigid beside the fallen beams, ears angled toward the speaker. Calder did not look away from the device above him. "His name is Superintendent Dorian Keats," he said quietly. "He coordinated the flight plan." Alistair knew the name. Keats had directed the search from the mainland, approved every grid, and announced that the sea had taken Calder. He had also been the one who sent Alistair and Orizon to the lighthouse alone. The low-engine note beyond the eastern ridge returned to Alistair's mind. A vessel absent from the official search chart. Keats had not remained on the mainland. He had reached the island through the hidden eastern cove. Why would he do this? Alistair asked. Calder drew a careful breath. The cargo was not only routine medicine. One case held limited emergency doses for a rare infection affecting several northern communities. The supply was scarce and valuable. His voice weakened, but his meaning remained clear. Keats arranged a false route. He wanted the aircraft down where no one would see. Water curled around Alistair's boots, colder now and nearly 15 centimeters deep. The tide was entering faster through cracks in the outer wall. He raised the radio. "Superintendent Keats, Captain Calder is alive. Medical support is required at Vesper Lighthouse." Silence answered. Then Keats spoke with the calm patience of a man correcting a junior officer. "You are confused, Alistair. The tunnel is unstable. Leave now, and we will handle the recovery properly." Recovery, not rescue. The same careful word used that morning. Alistair looked through the gap at Calder, then at the 2 sealed medical cases beside him. You knew he was. Here. The radio clicked off. Above them, metal scraped across stone. Orizon turned toward the stairway and released a low warning. Someone had entered the lighthouse. Alistair switched off his radio and lowered his voice. "Captain, what does that receiver control?" Calder glanced toward the red light. A radio-triggered ignition system. "I heard Keats testing it last night." Alistair looked toward the fuel container he had already disconnected. The receiver remained active, but without the ignition unit and its power lead, It could no longer start the fire Keats intended. The red light still blinked, tracking radioactivity, but the immediate danger had been reduced. Orison sniffed along the base of the blockage, then moved 3 meters down the right wall. He stopped beneath a rusted maintenance shaft, nearly 60 centimeters wide, steep but broken by old iron footholds. Cold air flowed through it with a trace of rain. Alastair followed and aimed his torch upward. The shaft rose toward the surface. Too narrow for a grown man, wide enough for Orison. The old keeper records mentioned an emergency air channel, Calder said. Footsteps sounded overhead. Slow, measured, not rescue crews rushing to help. Orison looked back at Alastair. The amber in his eyes held no fear, only attention. Alastair retrieved the compact emergency beacon from his jacket and attached it securely to the dog's harness. Find help, he whispered. Orison did not move. He glanced toward Calder, as if unwilling to leave the trapped man. Alastair placed one hand against the shepherd's wet shoulder. You found him. Now bring them to us. Orison pushed into the shaft and began climbing. Stone scraped softly beneath his paws. Within seconds, the darkness swallowed him. Alastair returned to the barrier and examined the sawn timbers. The center beam rested against the steel brace pinning Calder's side of the passage. Moving it incorrectly could collapse more stone. He chose the outer beam instead and worked the multi-tool beneath a rusted fastening. Above, the footsteps stopped directly over the chamber. A heavy object struck the iron plate at the top of the stairs. Once, twice, then silence. Calder's eyes narrowed. He is sealing the entrance. Water reached Alastair's calves. He pulled harder against the fastening until it gave with a dull snap. The outer beam shifted several centimeters. It was not enough for Calder, but it opened a gap for one medical case. Calder pushed it through with his good arm. Take that one first, he said. People are waiting for it. Alastair dragged the case clear. You are coming before the second. A faint sound traveled through the maintenance shaft. Orison's paws were no longer moving. Then, far above, the German shepherd barked once. A man shouted. The radio on Alastair's shoulder came alive with overlapping static, followed by a distant Canadian Coast Guard voice. Emergency beacon received. Vesper Lighthouse team confirmed status. Before Alastair could answer, the remote receiver above Calder changed from blinking to a steady red glow. It could no longer ignite the disconnected fuel container, but somewhere inside the lighthouse, another mechanism had just activated. The steady red glow was followed by a low mechanical hum inside the wall. Alastair raised his radio. Canadian Coast Guard rescue crew. This is Officer Vautrin beneath Vesper Lighthouse. Captain Calder is alive. The main entrance has been sealed, the tunnel is flooding, and a second device is activated. Static broke across the channel. Then a woman answered. Officer Vautrin, your beacon is confirmed. Rescue vessel is 3 kilometers southwest and closing. Can you reach the surface? Alastair looked at the water climbing past his knees. Negative. Follow the beacon on K9 Orison. He has reached the eastern maintenance outlet. A heavy impact sounded through the ceiling. Dust drifted from the stones. Calder looked toward the black receiver above him. That sound came from behind the brace. Alastair aimed his torch through the opening. The first ignition unit had been disconnected, but a second cable ran from the receiver into the wall and disappeared behind the steel support trapping Calder. A faint warning tone began to pulse. The device was retracting a locking pin that helped support the steel brace. Keats was trying to close the passage before they could reach Calder. Move as far right as you can, Alastair said. Calder pressed himself against the wall and protected the remaining medical case with his good arm. Alastair wedged the multi-tool beneath the outer timber and leaned his weight into it. The beam groaned. Water surged through the lower gap, rising several centimeters in seconds. Again, Calder urged. Alastair pulled. The fastening tore loose, and the timber rolled into the current. The opening widened enough for a person to crawl through, but the steel brace remained low. Alastair entered first, keeping his body beneath it. The warning tone quickened. He followed the cable to a compact power pack fixed behind the brace. Rather than disturb the receiver itself, he disconnected the pack and pulled the cable free. The tone stopped. The red light faded. Silence returned. Calder released a breath that sounded almost like a prayer. "You should know," he said. "Keats planned this long before the flight." Before Alastair could answer, a deep vibration traveled through the chamber. A surge from the rising tide struck the outer wall, and a fresh stream poured through a crack near the floor. Water rose to Calder's waist. "We discussed that outside." Alastair crouched beside him. "Put your good arm around my shoulders." Calder tried to stand, but his legs failed beneath him. Alastair caught him gently and shifted his weight. The pilot was weak from cold and 4 days without proper food, yet he still reached for the second medical case. "Leave it for now," Alastair said. "People are waiting for it." Calder's voice was barely more than air. "I know. That is why I stayed." Alastair secured the first case to his belt and guided Calder through the opening. Stones scraped against the steel brace above them, but it held. From somewhere high in the maintenance shaft came Orizen's bark, followed by several human voices. The rescue crew had found him. "Officer Vautrin," the radio called, "we have located the eastern outlet. Your dog led us to a sealed grate. We are opening it now." Alastair guided Calder toward the shaft. The water reached his thighs and moved with enough force to challenge every step. At the base of the channel, a rope dropped from above. Orizen appeared at the opening, his face framed by rain and pale daylight. His harness was muddy, and one paw favored the ground, but his eyes remained fixed on Alastair. "Send Calder first," Alastair called. Rescue workers lowered a support sling. Alastair secured it around the pilot and attached the medical case. As Calder began to rise, he reached down and touched 2 fingers to Orizen's muzzle. "You came back," he whispered. The dog stayed until the pilot disappeared into the light. Then a sharp crack echoed behind Alastair. The steel brace shifted. The blocked chamber began to fail, and the second medical case was still inside. The second medical case remained visible through the shifting barrier, less than 2 meters beyond the opening, while stone dust drifted into the rising water. Alastair looked up the maintenance shaft. Calder had reached the surface, and the rescue crew was preparing to lower the sling again. "Officer Vautrin, attach yourself now," the rescue leader called. Another crack moved through the chamber. Alastair clipped the rope to his harness and tightened it. He did not cross back beneath the steel brace. Instead, he knelt on the safer side of the opening and studied the case. The broken strap floated loosely in the current, close enough to reach with the right tool. "Lower the retrieval hook," he called. A moment later, a second line descended through the shaft with a small rescue hook attached. Alastair guided it through the gap using the end of his torch. The first attempt missed. Water pushed the case against the wall. The second caught beneath the handle, but slipped free when another surge entered the tunnel. Above him, Orizen barked once, sharp and urgent. 10 seconds, the rescue leader warned. Alastair steadied the hook and waited for the current to turn. When the case drifted forward again, he caught the handle cleanly. "Haul the cargo line." The rope tightened. The medical case slid beneath the brace and cleared the failing chamber just as part of the outer timber dropped into the water behind it. "Now pull me." The main line lifted Alastair from the flooded passage. Darkness closed. Around him as he rose through the maintenance shaft, one shoulder brushing cold stone. Orizen's bark echoed from above, guiding him toward the pale circle of daylight. Then gloved hands caught his arms and drew him onto the wet grass. Rain touched his face. For several seconds, he could only breathe. Orizen pushed close at once, nose moving over Alastair's coat, hands and shoulders as though counting every part of him. "I am here," Alastair whispered, resting one hand against the dog's soaked neck. "You brought them to us." A few meters away, paramedics had wrapped Calder in thermal blankets. His face was pale, but his eyes were open. The first medical case rested beside the stretcher. When the second emerged from the shaft on the cargo line, relief softened his expression. "Both," he murmured. Alastair shook his head and looked at Orizen. "Because he found the way out." Near the lighthouse entrance, Superintendent Dorian Keats stood beside the rusted iron plate. Mud marked one knee of his coat, and the old locking bar lay near his boot. The low-engine Alastair had heard beyond the eastern ridge, now had an answer. Keats had reached the island aboard a service boat hidden in the cove, outside the official search route. 2 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers had arrived on the second response vessel after the emergency beacon was received. They approached Keats calmly and identified themselves. "Superintendent, step away from the entrance." Keats raised his hands. "This is a misunderstanding. The tunnel was unstable. I was securing the site." Calder heard him from the stretcher. Fear crossed his face, followed by resolve. "I saw him remove the aircraft's portable data unit before he sealed the tunnel," Calder said. "Search his boat. It is there." Keats glanced toward the eastern path. Orison stepped between him and the ridge. The German shepherd remained silent, body still, amber eyes fixed on him. The officers detained Keats without struggle, while another team searched the hidden vessel. Minutes later, a voice came over the radio. They had recovered the missing flight recorder, altered navigation equipment, and packaging linked to the medical shipment. The fog began to lift from the headland. Far beyond the lighthouse, sunlight touched the Atlantic in a narrow, silver line. Calder reached down and placed his hand on Orison's head. "Everyone searched the sea," he whispered. "You search for me." Orison stood quietly beneath his hand, listening as though the words were another signal only he could understand. The helicopter carried Captain Calder toward a hospital in Halifax, while the Canadian Coast Guard rescue vessel turned east with both medical cases secured below deck. Alastair remained on the island until the Royal Canadian Mounted Police evidence team arrived aboard the second response boat. The storm had weakened to a fine rain, and the fog lifted in slow layers from the grass. Without it, Vesper Lighthouse looked smaller than it had in the dark. Less like a warning, more like an old witness finally allowed to speak. Orison sat beside Alastair near the cliff, his injured claw cleaned and wrapped by a paramedic. The German shepherd watched the water but did not search it now. His breathing had settled. Every few seconds, his ears moved toward the voices behind them as investigators photographed the sealed entrance, examined the remote receiver, and carried equipment from the hidden eastern cove. Superintendent Dorian Keats had been taken aboard another vessel under police guard. He had said little after the flight recorder was recovered, though the evidence had begun speaking for him. Altered coordinates, false weather reports, private messages concerning the medical shipment. A service boat placed outside the official search route. A plan built carefully enough to mislead radar, aircraft, and trained officers. But not a dog standing at the bow with his back to the sea. Alastair lowered himself onto the wet grass beside Orison. For years, he had believed the avalanche in northern Alberta had taught him not to trust instinct. The truth was harder. It had taught him what happened when pride disguised itself as certainty. The instruments had shown a clean pattern. The dog had shown doubt. Alastair had chosen the answer that required less courage. Since then, every search had carried the same silent question. What if he missed the sign again? Orison leaned gently against his shoulder. No ceremony, no judgment, only warmth through a rain-soaked coat. You knew before any of us, Alastair said. The dog looked at him, amber eyes steady beneath the gray sky. Alastair thought of the oxygen mask beneath the earth, the false footprints, the 3 measured knocks, and the weak voice asking for help under meters of stone. None of those signs had been loud. Each could have been dismissed. Together, they formed a path. Mercy rarely arrived like thunder. Sometimes it appeared as a dog refusing to turn away. Later that evening, confirmation came over the radio that Calder was stable. His shoulder would require surgery, and recovery would take months, but he was expected to survive. The medicine had reached the northern community aboard a Royal Canadian Air Force transport aircraft before nightfall. At a small nursing station near the coast, refrigerated cases were opened beneath fluorescent lights, while families who had been warned of another delay received a different message instead. The supply had arrived. No one there knew about the cold tunnel, the rising tide, or the dog who climbed through stone to find help. They only knew that hope had reached them before the weather closed in again. Alistair listened to the update in silence. Then he removed the old whistle from beneath his jacket. It had belonged to Officer Nathan Belrose, the partner lost in the avalanche 8 years earlier. Alistair had carried it through every posting since, not as comfort, but as punishment. He turned it between his fingers. The metal was scratched and dull. Orison watched him. Nathan trusted the dog that day, Alistair said. His voice nearly disappeared into the wind. I should have. He fastened the whistle beside Orison's identification tag. The two pieces touched with a soft chime. The dog lowered his head, accepting the weight without understanding its history. Perhaps that was grace, to carry what another could no longer hold, without asking why. The lighthouse lantern above them remained dark, yet the clouds broke briefly over the Atlantic. A narrow beam of evening sun crossed the water and reached the island. Orison lifted his face into it. Alistair placed one hand against his shoulder. Some truths did not call out. They waited in silence for loyalty to hear them. The following spring, after investigators released the site, the first warm wind moved across the grass around Vesper Lighthouse. The tower no longer stood abandoned. Fresh white paint covered the old walls. New glass shone in the lantern room, and a Canadian flag moved gently above the keeper's cottage. Volunteers from nearby fishing towns had arrived with tools, lumber, coffee, and stories of relatives once guided home by that light. By late afternoon, the island smelled of cedar, salt, and warm engine oil. Alistair stepped from the Canadian Coast Guard launch with Orison beside him. The German shepherd's injured claw had healed, though a narrow, pale line remained across it. Nathan Belrose's whistle still hung beside his identification tag, making a quiet sound whenever he walked. Captain Emmerich Calder waited near the lighthouse door. His left shoulder had recovered enough for him to move without support, and the months since the rescue had returned color to his face. He smiled when Orison saw him. The dog paused for half a heartbeat, then crossed the distance with a low, eager sound and pressed his head against Calder's hand. I hoped you would remember me, Calder said. Orison leaned closer, as though remembering had never been in question. Inside the tower, the repaired machinery turned with a steady hum. Investigators had preserved one small section of the old wall near the iron floor plate. Mounted there was the cracked oxygen mask, cleaned but not altered. The words traced inside it remained visible. Not the sea. Beneath the display rested a simple plaque bearing the date of the rescue and the names of those who entered the tunnel. Orison's name appeared first. Alistair noticed it and looked toward Calder. Your decision? Calder nodded. The rest of us needed convincing. He did not. No speeches followed. The three of them climbed the spiral stairs slowly until they reached the lantern room. Through the new glass, the Atlantic stretched beneath a clear copper sky. 40 kilometers away, somewhere beyond the horizon, search crews had once looked for a body that was never there. Calder placed one hand on the brass railing. I heard them above me on the second night, he said. A helicopter passed over the island. I struck the pipe until I could not lift my arm anymore. Alistair said nothing. There were apologies too small for certain kinds of loneliness. Orison sat between them and watched the turning lens. Then on the fourth day, I heard digging, Calder continued. At first I thought the tide was shifting stone. Then I heard him bark. His hand rested gently between Orison's ears. That sound was the first thing I trusted. As the sun touched the horizon, the keeper activated the lamp. Gears moved. Glass caught fire with golden light. The beams swept across the island, passed over the cliff, and traveled into the gathering dusk. Once, twice. On the third turn, Orison rose. His ears pointed toward a distant ridge on the eastern side of the island. He stood perfectly still, listening. Alistair felt the old instinct to dismiss it. Wind through grass. A bird beneath the rocks. Nothing requiring concern. Then the whistle beside Orison's tag touched the metal plate with a soft chime. Alistair remembered a snowy ridge, a warning ignored, and the mercy of being offered the same choice again. He clipped the lead to Orison's harness. Show me, he said. Calder watched them descend the stairs together. There was no fear in the moment, only readiness. Outside, the restored light continued turning above the Atlantic, not promising that storms would end, only that someone was still watching. Orizon led Alastair toward the ridge at a calm, certain pace. Neither man knew what waited beyond it. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps another life hidden inside the silence. But Alastair no longer needed certainty before choosing to listen. Some miracles do not arrive with wings or thunder. They come quietly, on four paws, carrying an old whistle and the stubborn belief that no soul should be left alone in the dark.